You're listening to Release Your Resistance with Bex Beltran, episode 51. Welcome to Release Your Resistance. This is Bex. The only reason why any of us don't have what we want in life is because of our own resistance. Right now, I'm learning how to recognize and release my resistance, and this podcast tells you how you can release your resistance so that you can live the exact life that you want. Let's get started. Can you believe it's already the first Friday of December 2020? What a year, right? And besides all the obvious 2020 drama and excitement and surprises, I'm looking back over 2020 and thinking, wow, that's a lot. Not referring to the drama and excitement, but referring to this podcast. A year ago today, I was in the final stages of getting ready to launch. I think I had the trailer up on Apple Podcasts. I was growing my launch squad and planning the launch lunch to celebrate. I had mapped out all the episodes I thought I wanted to do for this whole year, including talking about my favorite teachers on the first Friday of each month. And here we are, a year later. And with just a few substitutions and adjustments, all of that has happened. It all became reality. And I don't want to get too far into the reviewing of this past year. I'm actually reserving an entire episode in a few weeks to review 2020 with you and share a really helpful tool that I have been using that you can start using now as you move into next year so you can see your own progress and accomplishments and really notice what you've learned and created. Oh, there I go again, getting too far off topic. Okay, back to my favorite teachers, right? My favorite teachers. I have had so much fun thinking about who I've learned from, whose work has literally changed my life, who I look up to as an example. I have enjoyed myself so much in sharing my love notes, thank you cards, and fan letters publicly. And I have heard from some listeners that you have bought the books, started listening to the podcast, and started following some of my favorite teachers too. I love that. The more, the merrier. And now we can all geek out together over the favorite teachers who we all share. Since this is the last First Friday in 2020, and since I am looking forward to 2021 already and how this podcast will be the same and how it will be different next year, I decided to make this episode a little more future focused. I'm thinking about who my favorite teachers will be in the future. Who will I fall in love with? Whose work will change my life next year? Whose content will be so good I cannot wait to share it with you? But how can I see into the future to talk about people I might not even know yet, whose existence I don't even know about yet, whose work I haven't encountered yet? One way is to reintroduce or remind myself and you of some teachers who I have read in the past or been curious about or been interested in, but maybe I haven't fully checked them out yet and followed their work enough to move them into my favorite status yet. Then I also have other categories of teachers who I think could make it into the favorite status in the coming year. I hope by hearing about these teachers and these categories, it will open your mind for you to find some more of your next favorite teachers too. First, let's talk about people I'm already aware of who you may have already heard about too. I have a whole list of people I'm interested in whose work I've read or have on my wish list. They include, but are not limited to, Alyssa Vitti, Dr. David Perlmutter, Dr. Cal Newport, Dr. Carol Dweck, Dr. Susan David, Gretchen Rubin, and probably many, many more. So many, right? Just saying and hearing that list out loud to myself gets me really excited, and I cannot wait to dive in. Since there are a few of them, I'll just give you a sentence or two about each one of them. I heard about Alyssa Vitti from a few different podcast interviews, and I've started listening to her book, In the Flow, and I've joined her Facebook group, and I've downloaded her app, which I love and have recommended to so many people. So it is safe to say she's already pretty much become one of my favorite teachers, and I may dedicate an episode to her next year, or at least maybe I'll do a book report on one of her books. She has spent the past 15 years studying, researching, and teaching women how to stop hormonal chaos and get into hormonal flow. You know, I love thinking about being in flow. This was a completely new topic for me, and I didn't even know being in flow hormonally was possible. But as soon as I heard the concept of matching my tasks and my socializing and my projects and how I choose what to do and how to exercise specifically to my hormonal rhythm, it made perfect sense to me. And I decided I wanted to explore further. So Alyssa Vitti's work has been a hot topic for me in 2020. And if we've spent any time together, you have probably heard me talking about what I've already learned from her so far. Another possible future favorite teacher is Dr. David Perlmutter. I also heard him interviewed on a few different podcasts this past year, and I was so impressed with his message and his demeanor, I had to look him up. And my pod club, which is like a book club, except we just listen to one podcast episode and discuss it instead of reading a whole book, we used one of the podcasts he was interviewed on for one of our meetings this past year. Dr. Perlmutter's books include the New York Times bestseller Grain Brain, as well as Brainwash, and so many others. And I was really moved by the book Brainwash and his description of the connection between flour and sugar and dementia and other cognitive impairments. His writing can be a little too scientific for me, so sometimes it is hard for me to follow, but I love listening to him being interviewed on podcasts. The next possible future favorite teacher to mention is Dr. Cal Newport. I got super excited when I first quote-unquote met Cal Newport, probably about 4 or 5 years ago. His message and his theories were so clear and direct that I got his book, So Good They Can't Ignore You, right away, and I loved the whole theme and all the advice. Then, over the years, as other teachers made their way into my awareness, I didn't continue to follow him as much until I was reminded of him again recently when I heard him on a Jenny Blake Pivot podcast episode discussing his book, Digital Minimalism, Choosing a Focused Life in a Noisy World. And it reminded me of how much I appreciated his direct style. It made me want to get to know him and his work again. He writes about the intersection of technology and culture. Years ago, I started reading the book Mindset. I found the description and examples of the difference between a fixed and a growth mindset very interesting, but I didn't finish reading the book because, honestly, the recognition of the fixed mindset hit a little too close to home, and I found myself blaming myself for holding myself back with that type of thinking. Ever since I put the book down and never picked it up again, though, I have been thinking about it and realizing it really was helpful and profound information, and I should probably give the book another try. But for some reason, I couldn't find it available to listen to from any of my library apps or from Audible, and I tried so hard. Listening is my preferred method of reading nonfiction, and I didn't think I would pay close enough attention if I read it with my eyes. So I waited and kept waiting and looking, and finally, in October, I got the email that the audiobook was available. So I decided to listen to it like it was my job, and I loved it. And I took notes, and then I realized that I wanted to follow along and go back and reread and underline and look up things that she talked about. So I did end up ordering the print copy of the book too. And all of this to say, Dr. Carol Dweck, who's the author of Mindset, might just be one of my future favorite teachers. Another teacher whose interview we used for a pod club in 2020 is Dr. Susan David. She is one of the world's leading management thinkers and an award-winning Harvard Medical School psychologist. She is the author of the book Emotional Agility, which introduced me to the most amazing concept: how to get insight about what happens from our feelings and then use this awareness to align our values and make changes. This work aligns so perfectly with my coaching experience and philosophy. A few years ago, I was a huge fan of Gretchen Rubin, and I just couldn't stop talking about her and her book, The 4 Tendencies. The book describes how we gain self-knowledge by considering the answer to this simple question: how do I respond to expectations? I talked about the 4 tendencies with my coworkers. I made everyone in my family take the quiz to see what their tendencies were. I explained my own and other people's behaviors through my understanding of the tendencies. It seemed so helpful and interesting. And as time passed, though, I got interested in other subjects and other authors, but I always remember how profound this methodology was for me and for the people who I shared it with. So maybe in 2021, I will revisit Miss Rubin's work and share something about the 4 tendencies in a podcast episode. So those are some of my candidates for future favorite teachers. The next category of candidates for future teachers include my colleagues. For example, I learned so much from other podcasters and other coaches. I've met some really interesting and inspiring people this year. In fact, I've been interviewed as a guest on 2 other podcasts so far. So if you want to hear my conversations with another podcast host, check out the Self Project podcast on December 16th, 2020 with Christy Martin, who is a life transformation coach who helps women rediscover their magic with human design, spirituality, and creativity. Aren't you so excited to meet her? I was also interviewed by the host of the Joyful Headspace podcast. Marissa Selfike calls herself a word bender. Isn't that interesting? She's the author of the upcoming book, Edified. I look forward to collaborating with other podcast hosts and coaches and personal development professionals. Just like in June of this year, I introduced you to one of my favorite teachers, Nicole Perkins, in an interview on this podcast, and I am thinking about introducing you to more of my colleagues in interviews in the coming year. You'll have to let me know if you have someone in mind for me to talk with. I've also met so many interesting people through this podcast, through networking, and through some really fun Facebook groups that I'm in, including Friendship 5x5, which is the Facebook group I run for fun, friendly females. So if that fits you, consider joining us in that group if you haven't joined us yet. And I am so grateful that despite the twists and turns of 2020, I've still been able to connect with, meet, and get to know so many new people who are so lovely and interesting and who I am sure will teach me so much as we continue our relationships. The most non-traditional category of my future favorite teachers has been my coaching clients. I love meeting with them each week and helping them get awareness around their thoughts, and I always feel like I learned so much about myself when I'm coaching someone else. Coaching my clients helps me see a different way of thinking through learning about their perspectives and thinking habits. I get to notice what's a big deal for them that's not for me, and vice versa. The willingness of my clients to be open and vulnerable and consider questions and be coached makes me a better coach and a better client too, because yes, I do get coached by my coach weekly as well. I love seeing transformation in all of us and being reminded that anything is possible. And it wouldn't be a 2020 First Friday Release Your Resistance episode without a thank you card, love note, and fan letter. So this month, this love note, thank you card, and fan letter goes out to you, my podcast listener and coaching client. I love you so much. You are amazing and interesting and inspiring. I cannot express to you how honored and flattered I am that you listen to this podcast and that you tell me what you learned and you leave comments and send me messages. It just makes my day every single time, and it keeps me motivated to keep thinking about and improving this podcast. I love looking at my statistics and thinking about who is listening and what they're thinking about. I love when you refer back to something you heard me mention and tell me about it, or when you try an exercise that I suggest to you and let me know how it goes. You may think you're one of my fans if you listen and re-listen to these episodes, and I want to tell you, I am your fan too. I love that you are interested in personal development. I think it is so great that you are curious about learning how your mind works. So thank you for coming along with me and for sharing your feedback with me. And I do consider you one of my favorite teachers too. Next year is going to be season 2 of the Release Your Resistance podcast. So I am thinking of switching it up a little. I don't think I'll talk about a favorite teacher on the first Friday of every month anymore, but I can imagine myself giving you a book report about a teacher I'm learning about. And like I mentioned, I am also considering incorporating some interviews with guests. I've only had one interview on this podcast in the past year, so it might be interesting to have some more of those next year. Do you have any feedback and ideas and suggestions for what I should do with this podcast in season 2? I would love to hear from you. You can share your feedback with me in 2 ways. Well, 3 ways, I guess. You can either send me an email at hi@bexb.org and just tell me what you think. You can also share your feedback with me anonymously with an online survey, or you can schedule a call so that we can have a voice-to-voice phone call where we can actually talk to each other and ask and answer questions like a conversation. And in exchange for your time and your thoughtful responses, I will give you some of my time and my thoughtful responses. So let's spend an hour on the phone together, 30 minutes for me to interview you about this podcast and your thoughts and your suggestions for next year, and 30 minutes for you to have one of my top 3 strengths, either coaching, business brainstorming, or tech tutoring. You can set this up if this is what you want by going to the show notes for this episode at bexb.org/futurefavorites and scroll all the way down to the bottom to find a link either for the online anonymous listener survey or the link to my calendar so that you can schedule our interview. And if you're on my email list, I have also included those links for you on this week's email so that you can find them easily. And that is it for today's Future Favorite Teachers discussion. If you're on my email list, you are one of my favorite people. So I have sent you a list of these teachers with links to their work so that you can easily check them out for yourself and maybe give me your feedback. If you're not on my email list, make sure to join at bexb.org/favorites so you will always get reminded of each week's new episode. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great week, and I will talk to you next Friday. This has been Release Your Resistance. Thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, make sure you're subscribed and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Also, think about someone who you know who would love this episode and share it with them. There should be a share button on your app if you're listening to this on your phone. If you'd like to continue this conversation one-on-one or in real time, come visit me on my site at bexb.org to see how we can work together.